Okay, so, oh, sounds like someone just joined. No, we're good. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Gaming Technology and Accessibility in Academic Libraries webinar today. My name is Courtney Montgomery, and I'm the Outreach Lead for Mount Royal University. So before we begin today's presentation, I would just like to acknowledge that Mount Royal University is situated on an ancient and storied place within the hereditary lands of the Niitsitapi, Blackfoot, Ihari, Nakota, Tutina, and Métis nations. It is a land steeped in ceremony and history that, until recently, was used and occupied exclusively by peoples indigenous to this place. I feel it's also important to acknowledge the systematic violence and resultant protests currently happening across North America. We unequivocally condemn all forms of racism as well as all forms of violence. And we pledge to work harder each day to foster a community of inclusiveness, respect, and solidarity among our faculty, staff, and students. You have joined us today out of an interest in learning, and I encourage you to acknowledge the collective learning that needs to be done in our world as we move forward. So today's webinar will consist of 3 parts. A presentation, followed by a panel discussion, and lastly, some Q&A. I encourage you to write your questions in the chat box, and I will pose them to our panelists and presenters at the end. Now, because this is an accessibility presentation, I would also encourage you to use your closed captioning option. It's just on the bottom little menu, and that will help you access the words we're saying if you're having trouble following along. This is about accessibility, and if we were not paying mind to that, I think we would be missing the point. So I'd now like to introduce our speakers. Angie Brunk is an experienced public service librarian who recently completed an MAS in human factors and usability testing. Angie was born with a visual impairment and has worked with many people with disabilities throughout her career, and she's currently working as a consultant for accessible and inclusive design. And she is joined by her co-author, Dr. Dale Manob. Dale has taught and practiced rehabilitation counseling and library science on the graduate level and is currently the Utah-Nevada MLS Regional Director in the School of Library and Information Management at Emporia State University. He not only has an interest in underserved patrons of academic libraries, but also in accessible games and gamification and in humanistic lifelong learning. Angie and Dale are the co-authors of Chapter 4, Level Up, in the recently published Games and Gamification in Academic Libraries, which is available now as an ebook through the MRU library. So I'm now going to turn it over to Dale and Angie.
Okay, as I get my presentation up, if you hear yowling or see a orange streak of fur, yeah, I have 3 cats, and sometimes there's not a lot I can do to keep them contained, so to speak. So I believe we're only talking about a small part of our chapter, which is how to design a gaming outreach event that is accessible and inclusive. So there's a lot more information contained in our chapter, and because of time constraints, we're going over a lot pretty fast. So I encourage you to read the chapter. And I believe the first slide goes to Dale.
Yes, hello everyone. And let's first look at the models of disability. When I was first going through graduate school and teaching rehabilitation counseling, we really focused on the medical model. Though we were going into, I think we were touching, we're slowly going into the social justice model at the time. But anyway, let's look at the 2 models. The medical model, or as some would say, how do we fix broken people? Here the focus is on the disability. How can we treat or reduce this disability? And if the person with the disability can't use the communication or access venue provided, this person owns the problem and needs to do something. So, for instance, for me, with my vision, I'm not able to always see the what's posted on the restaurant boards behind the counter. A little fuzzy, and even if I get close, I can't read it. And so, in this case, according to the medical model, the onus of getting to understanding the menu and ordering from the menu would be on me. So I can very well turn to my friend and say, can you read this? Turn to a customer and say, excuse me, could you read that? I can't read it. Or ask the staff to read it for me. And an alternative, and I'll talk about it next, would really be to have the restaurant have a printed menu, in really contrasting colors. That would be very helpful. And another example would be, I remember years ago, I was pushing my grandmother through the crowded streets of Tokyo. Has anyone been there? Then you really know how crowded it can be, and it was a walkway. And as I'm pushing her through the walkway, she says, oh, no, I don't want to bother all these other people. They're walking. They have to walk around us. I told the grandmother, these people, they appear to have good legs, so they could just walk around you. They can do that, and we have as much right to be going down this walkway as the others. So you can see where her mind was. It was really the medical model, that the onus was on the person with the disability. Next is a social justice model, and it's how we fix the systems so people can participate fully on their own, and hopefully with dignity. The focus is on the person. How can we modify the environment, both physically, socially, and culturally, so that the person can fully participate? How can we remove the barriers for this person? And in rehab counseling, there's always been a distinction made between a disability and a handicap. And so we may have a disability, but the handicap can be reduced or removed by changing the environment. And there are those who say the disability could also be removed or reduced as well. Examples could be accessible water fountains, ramps, and hopefully both these would be accessible with dignity. I'll give you an example. If you use a wheelchair and you need to go to the second floor and there's stairs, you could have the people in the upper office come down and say, oh, we'll carry you, or we'll push your wheelchair up. Or I know another example of a school where you have to go down a freight elevator, go through narrow stacks, and then take another set of elevators, and it's just something else. There's access, but there really isn't access with dignity. And it's interesting to note, with all these different modes of access, hopefully with dignity, people without disabilities use them also. So how many of you have actually used a ramp? Or have you ever pressed the big blue button to the side of the entrance? If you have a lot of things in your hands, maybe you're carrying things. So actually everyone really benefits by having accessible environments, socially, culturally, and also websites. Accessible websites, people without disabilities find them really positive. They give their thumbs up for those. So it's really good for all. So in sum, knowing that you don't have a disability now, okay, but you may have one in the future, which model do you like? Do you like the medical model or the social justice model? I understand both certainly have their uses, but I think in this discussion, the social justice model really fits well. Okay, Angie.
So then there are several areas you need to consider when planning a game night with accessibility in mind from the beginning of the design process. You need to think about the publicity for the game night, the activities, and physical access to the spaces. A lot of us work in academic libraries with inaccessible spaces. The idea that a building is grandfathered in is somewhat erroneous. In the US, at least, you are eventually expected to fix that. However, you can get by for a number of years with a plan to fix it as opposed to actually fixing it. But the fact of the matter still remains that many libraries, especially older academic libraries, have areas that are not accessible or might technically be accessible, but still incredibly difficult to get to. And so we need to think about that when we're planning an event. So when we're thinking about publicity, the first thing is to publicize the event in multiple formats. That's just good practice anyway, but from an accessibility point of view, it makes it more likely that somebody with various disabilities will be able to access the publicity materials, know about the event, and be able to attend the event. All of your publicity materials should have information about requesting accommodations or expressing a concern. In our chapter and in my practice as a consultant, I advocate very strongly that librarians have somebody designated to be in charge of accessibility, because if it's everybody's responsibility, it becomes nobody's responsibility. So, have an actual person that people can contact to talk about accessibility issues and have that information readily available in your publicity materials. There are accessibility guidelines that are evolving for all the different formats of publicity that we might use. I actually have an article on that in Marketing Library Services March and April issue. And because information today only requires 90 days of exclusive access, I am able to share that with you. It's probably best if I do so discreetly. So if you're interested, email me and I can send you a copy of that article. But it's a lot of common sense things like using high contrast colors. Don't try to make it too busy. Just because you can do it in Canva does not mean you should. Simple is better than crowded for getting information across. It might not be as eye-catching, but it really doesn't matter if something's eye-catching if people can't read it. And then Dale, again, was going to talk a bit about what to do if you offer prizes at these events so that it is accessible and equitable and enjoyable for all.
Yes, if you offer prizes for, say, your game night, they should be generally modest in value, though prizes can motivate participants in groups. You don't want to stress them out, really anyone. And if you're, so big prizes can cause us stress. So you really don't want anyone, even people with disabilities, to feel like they're holding back their group. So I recommend, and I guess we both recommend that the prizes be modest. Maybe gift certificates, could be candy, whatever, food, so on and so forth. If you offer prizes for multiple stations, make all activities accessible. So it's probably not a good idea to have accessible stations with prizes and then non-accessible activity stations without prizes. So once again, if there's prizes, make sure at different stations have them accessible. And make sure that everyone can win the big prizes. If you offer big prizes, if you happen to, make absolutely certain that participants with disabilities have an equal opportunity to participate and win. But again, I myself would recommend modest prizes. And please don't forget that verbal praise. Wonderful. That's great. Great job. Congratulations. Those are good too. Angie.
So we need to think about how you would expect someone to progress through the event. Think about how the activities are laid out and how you expect people to progress physically through the space. For instance, it might not be a big deal for someone like me who is a walker. I like to walk. I'm used to being very mobile and getting around places quite easily. So it might not be a big deal for me to backtrack across a space or have to move between floors. And I've been known to use that as a tactic when I'm doing library instruction. If I have a group that's restless and has a lot of excess energy. kind of, well, like with little kids, just wear them out a little. But if you have a game night and you don't know who's going to be there and you don't know what needs they might have, it's best to think about how someone could progress smoothly, easily, without a lot of backtracking through the space. And always think about when you're planning your events, again, in our libraries, not every bathroom is necessarily accessible. And that's something you should know about your own libraries, which of the bathrooms are actually fully accessible. And make sure that all the events, especially the larger events for the game night, are close to those accessible bathrooms. Kind of walk the path of how you might expect someone to progress through the event, or walk multiple paths if there are multiple paths available. And kind of think about how could we lay this out so that people can progress through with as few trips between floors, as few trips through down blind hallways or places that can be difficult to find. I understand the physical reality of libraries. The space we have available varies widely, and we don't get to design it for the game night, but you do get to design the path. So think about the best way to work with your building and create a logical, smooth, easy to follow path. Ideally, one that would allow a couple of different ways to progress through the event. And make sure that none of the activities you plan are in that one part of your building that probably isn't very accessible or is needlessly difficult to get to if somebody has mobility problems and perhaps uses a wheelchair or crutches or needs elevator access. So just make sure that that is planned out very precisely. One of the ways to do this and to think about how your event works is task analysis. And there are actually several really great resources online that break down task analysis in depth. Usability.gov actually has a great page on task analysis. But I'm just going to break it down in a more simplified way for you here. So task analysis is noting all of the steps and the physical and cognitive resources needed to complete a task. When you're training in human factors, one of the first things they often have you do is do a task analysis of opening a door. It's an everyday action that we do all the time, and some of it's muscle memory. And so it's very easy to forget how many steps are involved in this very simple process. Realistically, I've done plenty of event planning myself, so I understand the pressure you're under. Realistically, you're not going to get to do a full task analysis of all of your games and all of your activities, but it's a good frame of reference to use when you think about planning the event. And let's kind of look at a simplified task analysis and maybe a little clearer picture of exactly what I'm asking you to do. So let's look at a hand of Uno. It's a game that I think most people are familiar with. Briefly, if you're not, you're dealt, I can't remember if it's 5 or 7 cards, and they are all marked, except for the wild cards. They're all marked with either a number or a color. And you have to match either a color or a number. And the first person to get rid of all of their cards, as long as they have said Uno when they get down to the last card, is the winner. So you have to have the physical skills to grasp cards, which most of us take for granted, but actually there are a fair number of people who have difficulty with this. So a simple solution would be to have card holders available for those who want them. And there are a wide variety of card holders that are available on Amazon that aren't particularly expensive. Just have them out and available on the table if somebody wants them. It doesn't have to be a big accommodation that someone requests. A lot of these things can be integrated into your event. Again, the social justice model. It does require color vision to play Uno. There is debate about what and how much that affects play. There are cards that are accessible for color vision defects. and that are accessible via Braille for severe visual impairment as well. You need the visual acuity to see both the card that's laid out on the table and the cards that are in your hand. And then you need the dexterity to handle and manipulate the cards. There are ways around some of these problems, but when you're looking at activities, if you take a look at, oh, these are the physical and cognitive skills that someone needs. For instance, Trivial Pursuit. Don't get me wrong, I love Trivial Pursuit. The cards are tiny print, which unfortunately they carried over into the Wii version of the game, which was very disappointing. The cards are tiny print, and if you suffer from a print disability or a visual disability, reading the cards aloud could be problematic. Well, there are ways around that. If somebody doesn't want to read cards, you know, I'm sure we can bend the rules a little bit and maybe not let them read cards, or make sure that you have a few simple magnifying glasses available. A lot of us have tools on our phone that allow us to magnify or to even read text. Just be aware of some of the tools that are available and what you're asking people to do. And Dale, I believe, was going to talk about having a variety of games available.
Yes, consider borrowing or buying a variety of popular, accessible board games. Uno, as mentioned before, as Angie did, and Scrabble are popular and they're accessible, Braille on the cards and the blocks. They don't require lengthy verbal instructions, which is a good thing because you might have participants whose first language is not English, or participants who find lengthy verbal instructions challenging. Also, Uno has simple cards. Too many words on the card might not be good for people whose first language is not English, or for, once again, people who find lengthy or a lot of verbiage challenging. Also consider asking for input from your accessibility office or student support groups. Your accessibility office may have accessible board games to borrow and helpful ideas and tips. And there may be a board game community for students with disabilities on campus who could offer helpful ideas as well. I'm sure your disability resource office would know of this. Also, when planning activities, make sure to choose activities that will work with a wide range of ability levels. Just like people without disabilities, participants with disabilities do have a wide range of abilities. And just like people without disabilities, there may be people with disabilities who choose to watch, not participate. They want to socialize, encourage, cheer people on. So please make sure to make space for these folks. And finally, Jenga might not be for anyone, but the first time I saw Jenga was a video of a cat playing Jenga. It was just amazing. Do you think the cat was playing it? Anyway, having a variety of accessible games is the best way to go. Angie.
All right. So there is no way that I can give you a dissertation on how to do this because it's going to vary so much by system and by game. And the Library of Congress actually has a really great live guide on accessible electronic games. And there are a few bloggers and disabled Twitter users that specialize in electronic games and accessibility. But what you need to know at this point is that if you are using electronic games, when I did game nights at Emporia State, we set up multiple video game systems. So whoever is in charge of the video game systems needs to have some idea of how to access the accessible settings of the games and of the consoles that are being used. Just assign them that task, that you need to look up the accessibility settings, both for the console and for the games, know how to use them. And if you have a variety of games available and are conscious, look at the task analysis again. Some video games require very high hand-eye coordination maybe even a touch of athletic ability. I'm looking at you, Dance Dance Revolution. But others might require fine motor skills. Yeah, I did try to play Jenga on the Wii. That was interesting. Whereas others might have visual issues, like I said, Trivial Pursuit. And unfortunately, there was no way to enlarge that I could find. But on the other hand, there are other trivia games that I've played on the Wii that have fairly large fonts, high contrast, were much easier to read. So the trivia games could be a lot of fun, did not require as much coordination. But just having a variety of the games, not just the most popular Fortnite or whatever is popular at the moment, to cater to a wide variety of users' needs. And of course, if you encourage students to bring their own games, you know, we will have X, Y, and Z systems available. Feel free to bring your own games. If you have a disabled student who's a gamer, they're going to be encouraged to bring their own games and maybe introduce people to a whole different way of playing games. So that is mostly the formal part of our presentation. We were trying to keep things quick so that we could move on to questions and the panel discussion. Because we both feel that having this be interactive is very important, because it seems like every time we talk about disability, there are a lot more questions and hopefully a lot of really good discussion. Our contact information is up here, and Courtney also has that. So, you know, please certainly feel free to reach out to either of us. I do have resources on our website, on my website, including a previous paper that Dale and I wrote together on instructional games and universal design for learning. So thank you, Courtney. And let's see, I will stop sharing, and then I believe we can get on to the panel discussion.
All right. Thank you so much, Angie and Dale. That was wonderful. I'm now going to welcome our additional panelists. We have Deb Steele and Eric Christensen. So Deb is an assistive technology advisor here at Mount Royal University. Deb, would you please tell us a bit about your role and the accessibility options available for students here at MRU?
I sure will, and thanks for coming, everybody. Welcome. I've worked at MRU for about 12 years, and most of them have been in accessibility services. So in my current role as assistive technology advisor, I meet with students who have disability-related barriers, and we discuss on an individual basis what kinds of things would be helpful for students to overcome anything that's problematic for them in the learning environment. So generally speaking, the things we use most often are audio recording devices so that lectures can be recorded. It's a little different now with Google Meet, and it's all online and gets recorded. But when it's face-to-face, we'll use things such as a recording pen or Microsoft OneNote that does a time-stamped recording that'll enable people to be able to play back just certain specific parts of a lecture, which is really handy and time-saving. Text-to-speech, which is when any electronic content that you have on a screen could be read aloud. So that's something that a lot of our students use both for course materials and during exams. If they write exams with us, we have an exam center, usually, not right now, it's closed, but usually students will come to write with us and they'll be able to access a great variety of different tools that will help overcome their barriers. And then dictation, that's another one we talk about quite a lot. And then screen magnification. Those are kind of the main things that we work with for students. And so generally students will come to us. I will meet with them one-on-one after they've already met with an accessibility advisor, and we discuss what they need, get it all set up, and help to do some training for them.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. I had no idea that we had that many options available, so that's really great for our students. Now, Eric is a subject librarian here at MRU, and he wears a number of hats. Eric, do you want to just tell us a little bit about your role, your interest in gaming, technology, and accessibility?
Sure. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. a number of hats really sets me up to be a long explanation, but I'll try to keep it short. So I'm Eric Christensen. I'm the subject librarian at Mount Royal University for psychology, counseling, wellness, health and physical education, and the conservatory. So my primary role in a nutshell at Mount Royal is I'm an instructional librarian, as the librarians are at MRU. So, we teach, dozens and dozens of information literacy courses every year across a variety of disciplines, including other things like gen ed. We all chip in and things like chemistry. So we're kind of generalists. My interest in gaming and technology goes far back. I'll plug my mom. When I grew up, she worked at a video store when I was very little, so I had access to free, unlimited video game rentals, which is pretty incredible and unprecedented. So I've always been interested in games and technology, mostly though because of storytelling and interaction, and I see it as an art. And prior to Mount Royal, I worked in education technology and instructional design. So I've been interested in gaming, but also the accessibility aspect and how games-based learning can be integrated into curriculum. I would say that's probably the in a nutshell what I'm interested in.
All right, awesome, thank you. So we are going to begin the panel now. We're going to follow it up with some Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions that came up during the presentation, or you have questions that come up during the panel, if you just want to keep them in chat, and I will keep an eye on the chat, and then I will address those to our panelists. If you have a question for a specific panelist, if you just want to write their name in there, that will help me direct them. But right now, we are going to open up the panel. So what I'm going to do is I'll go through the questions one by one, and I will give each panelist a chance to give a little bit of an answer. So the first question that I have for our panelists here today, so that's Angie, Dale, Deb, and Eric. What are some easy ways to increase accessibility to technology in our libraries and institutions? Dale, do you want to go first?
I'd say what I've noticed is sometimes I enter a library and I don't know where anything is, and even though the signs are large. So I would say just good signage, if your library allows it. I know one particular library does not allow any signage for some reason, but good signage and that information, so anyone, any student, anyone who comes in the library can see that there are accessible games available to check out or to use in the library.
Great. Eric, what about you?
I think there's a few things that we can do that are, and I know that you mentioned the word easy, so I'm trying to stick to easy. I think the first thing for library staff is some of the training around accessibility. So, raising people's technical awareness. They don't have to be experts, but in some of the accessibility features and the technology and the spaces that we offer in libraries, I think that goes a long way. I love when Angie said and Dale said about accessibility benefits everybody. There's a wide scope of accessibility considerations. So I think it's important that they let people know. I don't know if it's easy, but allowing for a degree of modularity in libraries, and particularly how they're designed, particularly around furniture. There's some interesting work. There was an interesting master's thesis from Western University called Accessibility and Academic Libraries, a Comparative Study. I believe it was a master's thesis. And it talked about the importance of seating and arrangement and giving more options to people, made people a lot more welcome in the library, but also a lot more comfortable. And then I think related to that, making those accessible technologies and that modularity as widespread as possible. So in a computer lab, rather than having just one accessible station, which sometimes we do need, but having as many of those accessibility features and technologies across our devices and technologies, make that the standard for people.
Great, yeah. Angie, would you like to weigh in?
Well, Eric stole most of my thunder, but for me, it's important that all frontline staff that would encounter people be trained in basic disability etiquette. I couldn't believe it, but at one institution I worked at, I actually had to tell library staff, don't chase down students in a wheelchair and tell them where the accessible workstation is. That might not be what they need to know. So just make sure that all staff is aware of basic disability etiquette and also aware of the free technology that is built into every modern OS to make the computers more accessible, and make sure IT will let you turn them on.
Very good. And Deb, what about you?
Okay, so all of those things plus, I would say that it's important to have staff in the library have some liaison with the accessibility services department so that we can kind of go back and forth and share ideas and do any kind of education that might be helpful in order for library staff to help anybody in the library, whether it's a student with a disability or not. But I think it's helpful to have that relationship building going on. We did a small tour of the newish library that we have at Mount Royal. I've brought a few students along with me with one of the people who were planning it, and we looked at some areas and got some feedback from students about different things. Maybe the contrast in signage, for example, might not have been high enough and that kind of thing. So I think just having those relationships can be really helpful.
Yeah, I completely agree. And you and I can work on building that more from this point out. We're going to go to our next question. And I'll get Angie to start this one off, then no one will steal your thunder. How do you see accessible gaming and technology contributing to the educational success of students and researchers?
Well, so I'll start with students. Most of my career has been spent at undergraduate serving institutions. I think it's important for students to see a wide variety of technology that's available so that they aren't intimidated when they encounter someone in the workplace who uses assistive technology or who has a disability, because we know that stigma still contributes significantly to unemployment among people with disabilities. So having exposure to a wide variety, having exposure to events that are planned with accessibility in mind, so that it's just a natural part of life, as opposed to, oh, we have to do special things for special people. Because I don't want anyone to think of the spectrum of human needs somehow encompassing aliens. You know, we all have different needs. So just exposure for students, for researchers. A lot of researchers don't think about questions of accessibility, especially when it comes to design. And the more they see that in action, the more likely it is to spread throughout the culture.
Absolutely. Deb.
I think that it's important that students, well, anybody, I guess, have fun with what they're doing. Like the more fun that you're having while you're learning or doing things, you're more motivated to keep going and to stay engaged with whatever it is you're doing. So I think that's important. Like the gaming aspect, the whole idea of it is to bring people in, build a little bit of community, and have a good time while you're doing it. And that just helps you to kind of want to stick with it.
Definitely. Eric.
I would agree with all of that. I mean, and I especially like the idea of fun. Universities are a place of personal transformation, but they should be a place of fun. To Deb's point, you know, there's a huge opportunity not only for students to see accessible technologies and have access to as many as they can in university, that we can provide that exposure that perhaps people wouldn't be able to afford in their personal life. But there's also a huge opportunity for library instruction and just library communities in gaming. So I know that gaming has a way to create kind of break down the barriers and introduce people to the library, increase the exposure between librarians and students. But there's also a lot of work done in information literacy instruction and game-based learning. And I wouldn't claim to be the expert in that. I'm going to plug my colleague at Mount Royal, Chris Thomas, who's done some research on this. He's talked a lot, and he's very well read on game-based learning and information literacy. And we know that works because there's a lot of work done in other disciplines. University of Connecticut had a program, I don't know if it's still on, teaching Latin through an online web-based board game. So all sorts of things where we can create learning environments or create learning opportunities through game and accessibility that way.
Yeah. Dale.
And building upon what Eric just said, in terms of educational games and their values, I remember speaking to a fellow who did the collection development for his library for video games, and he had educational games too. And he said it was challenging to get, there were professors on board, but there were some that were hesitant, using games, what is the value, and the value of certainly educational games that are accessible. That's something that I think they should learn more about and accept, and hopefully with more acceptance that there'll be more money for these accessible educational games. And there's wonderful ones in terms of the medical area. There's games. I heard there's a wonderful one in history, and I know many of you know more that are just wonderful. If these professors and students have access to it, or maybe you have a night where you could display all these wonderful educational games that have accessible features, I think that'd be a great thing.
Yeah, definitely. I know we have a couple of those in our library, but I'm not familiar with all of them. All right, so we had a question come up in the chat, and I have a question in my list, and I think they're related. If the person who wrote in the chat wants to just comment on what I'm asking after I ask it and say, have we covered what you asked? That'll help me out. But for now, to the panelists, this time I'm going to start out with Deb. How do you think that COVID-19 has impacted accessibility to resources, both in terms of barriers and opportunities?
I'll start with barriers. Obviously, it's been trickier to meet with people one-on-one. Typically, I would meet with a student in my office. We can see each other. They'd bring in their computer. We'd sit and talk about different things, and you could build an easy rapport. So that's missing a little bit now with not being able to actually meet anybody. On the other hand, video conferencing has been a pretty good tool to be able to do more or less the same kinds of things. It may not be people's preferred way to do it, but quite often we can get things done. Students can present their screen. I can see what's going on and say, click on that little button that says this, as opposed to trying to do it by memory. Video conferencing has really exploded, obviously, and I think that's a really good thing. And although it's not the preferred way to do it, at least we can still get the job done and still support students the way we need to.
Yeah. Angie, what are your thoughts on this?
So the thing I've noticed in terms of barriers is that some people definitely seem to be using COVID as an excuse. Oh, we have to just get this out to students. We can't worry about accessibility. And treating accessibility as an extra thing is so problematic, because it's harder to retrofit accessibility than it is to just build it in from the beginning. So you're actually creating more work for yourself. And it upsets me greatly that people are using this current situation, a situation which actually marginalizes people with disabilities further, because many disabled people have comorbidities that put them at high risk for COVID. So they're actually already marginalized, and then we're seeing further marginalization, and that bothers me. On the other hand, I do think COVID has shown that we can do a lot of things in ways that people with disabilities have been asking for a long time. Like maybe more jobs could be done via telecommuting, or more things can be done distance, which is something a lot of disabled people have been asking for quite a while.
Yeah, definitely. Dale, what are your thoughts on this?
Our school, our library school, we have a hybrid program. We meet online and also have Canvas, learning management system, for most of our core courses. And what I've noticed is that my students love the face-to-face aspect, but there are a lot of, I have a couple of students that I think have some anxiety challenges. And so in class, face-to-face, they're pretty well quiet, they don't say anything. But I noticed online, they start chatting, they're just more, they seem to participate more. And I think for those students who have these anxieties, they're able to benefit from the chat and so on and so forth. And another component I noticed is that for students who are not able to drive, say, having it online is great for them. And we do have some students that come from far distance that may need to ask family or friends to drive them to class. So that's my take.
All right, thank you. And lastly, Eric.
So I would echo everything that my colleagues on the panel had said. I'll start with a barrier, an electronic resources barrier. I think as the COVID-19 thing plays out, we're going to start to perhaps understand a bit better what accessible electronic books and accessible resources are. And we may be very choosy about how we acquire materials in the library moving forward. You know, how many clicks does it take to go through Adobe? Everybody here, I'm sure, has tried to use Adobe Digital Editions or something painful like that. Hopefully Adobe doesn't come after me. You know, and there's actually some interesting work that had been done prior to this crisis. So there was a great article titled "Are eBooks for Everyone" in the Journal of Electronic Resources Librarianship. And what they found is that the single publishers, so things like Springer, Palgrave, Gale, had better accessibility features than some of the aggregators like ProQuest. So I wonder if this will impact and kind of highlight some of the accessibility concerns about, you know, those kinds of resources. At the same time, there is an opportunity if instructors who have to, you know, scramble to build resources, move to things that are easy for them to have access to, such as open educational resources, things that traditionally have had a stricter or better promotion of accessibility standards. Those are kind of interrelated to some of the web standards, offering things in many different file formats. So I think it's possible that open access, OER, accessible features will be better highlighted because these questions are going to come up more frequently.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. Before we get into Q&A, I've just got one last question for our panelists. And we'll go with Eric first. Are there any other areas of our daily life that accessible gaming could create new opportunities for learning and development?
It's a big question. There's a lot.
You're on the spot.
There, I'm good. No, I'm just kidding. I think there's a huge amount of, and my background is more with electronic gaming. So I think in terms of learning, I think that what we can learn in libraries or borrow from, the STEM fields have done a really good job of not just using pre-created experiences or games for learning, but also how would you think through the logic of making something accessible and building a game and building in the logic to learn a skill. One of the things I've been thinking about that's been percolating in the back of my mind is computing in general. I think that as computing, you know, I don't have my smartphone in front of me because I've tried to remove as many distractions, but we have as many, all our devices are sealed. I grew up in the days when computers and technology were very modular and you could plug in all sorts of additions, you could customize them. And I wonder if, you know, the advantage of accessible technology, gaming and otherwise, or accessible computing, is that the more exposure people have, the more they're going to understand how computers work. The most recent example is the accessibility controller from Microsoft, which has a bunch of inputs and outputs. So if you had to customize a controller, you would learn a lot about how computers use logic, how functions work. The Raspberry Pi, when I worked in education technology, was a great tool for custom computing as it's related to gaming and learning. So I think there's some huge opportunities as there's more things available and we expose students to it about how technology works and how it can be used to serve everybody. Yeah,
definitely. Deb, do you have some thoughts on this?
I do. I think that I'm going to go back to community building and a little bit of sort of what you were touching on, Eric, the increased affinity for technology, I would call it, where the more people are using gaming to enjoy what they're doing, gives more comfort with technology. And I think the more comfortable people are with technology, the more likely they are to seek out other opportunities for themselves and look for other tools that might be helpful in their daily lives. And I think that's an important thing, especially because we're all literally on our computers pretty well all day, every day right now. And yeah, so I think that the increased affinity can really be helpful for people.
Yeah, definitely. I'm just thinking of like most of my friends with kids right now and how adept they are with technology versus my generation or even my parents' generation.
Yeah.
Dale, what are your thoughts on this?
Building upon the others, I think that, as you've probably all heard, the longer you live, the longer you live. We're all living longer, and the odds of having a disability perhaps in the future increase, though with great technologies out there, great whatever, medical treatments. But I think for people who have suddenly find themselves with a disability, or people through the years, seniors, say they're not able to see as well, hear as well, their sense of touch, so on and so forth. If they're made aware and known that there are accessible games for them, they can still play with their family and their friends. I think that's a wonderful thing. So making such accessible games available and knowable, have them know about these wonderful options for them, so they can still play their Jenga, I guess, or Monopoly, or whatever, with their friends.
Definitely. And Angie, I'll give you the last word on this.
Just going off of what everyone else says, as a librarian and someone who's also in UX, I think it's very easy for us to overestimate most people's facility with technology. And in fact, I witnessed in the library, even young people, the millennials, the generation that grew up with technology, I would still encounter students who'd say, I'm not really very computer literate. They might know one or two things. They might know their particular favorite game or application, but beyond that. So I would really like to see more gamification and accessible gamification used to increase that understanding and affinity for technology, because as much as we like to think millennials know this stuff, they don't. I know more than a lot of millennials, and I'm old.
All right. We were going to talk about resources, but I'm mindful of the time, and I want to make sure that we get to our chat questions. So the first question that we had was around COVID-19. I'm just going to read it out, and if anybody has anything to add to this, in addition to what we just spoke about. I hope my question isn't out of place. With the new concerns surrounding COVID-19, how does social distancing affect accommodating folks who use mobility equipment while making sure people can actually participate, or enough people can actually participate? If all you've got is a small or medium conference room, for example, an event that can hold only 4 or 5 people might not be as fun and would limit the variety of game options. Does anybody have thoughts on that?
I do think that's a valid concern. I know that, so I'm a singer, and we've basically, all the professional organizations for singers have basically decided that we can't do anything in person until there's a vaccine. And I think we need to be very mindful of questions like this and decide what events can be done virtually, even if it's not ideal. And I don't think anybody thinks it's ideal at this point. But what can we do virtually to maximize participation? How can we be mindful about planning events so that you don't hold a lot of things in a small conference room that can only accommodate 4 or 5 people?
Great. I'm going to go on to our next question. So what are your views on the reasonable expense provisions of accessibility legislation as it pertains to smaller institutions with limited budgets? If the responsibility for removing barriers lies with the institutions, is there a point where accommodations become untenable?
Ooh.
Dale, you look like you might have an answer for that.
That's a good question. I'm not familiar with things in Canada, but that's certainly something I probably need to think about and discuss with my colleagues, especially Angie. That is, where is the point? I myself, my background, right, says as much as you can provide, accessibility for students. But I know there's somewhere you just need to compromise and balance things out. Angie, your thoughts?
Well, so I've spent most of my life at institutions that were the left-handed, red-headed stepchild that got no funding. So the reality is that if you're creative, there is a lot you can do without busting budgets. But at some point, you kind of have to start busting heads, because I don't know about the law in Canada, but in the US, the ADA is a 30-year-old civil rights law. And I cannot think of any other circumstance where we would say, but it's too hard to enforce a civil rights law. So I understand that there are realities that maybe you can't expand the hallways of your college to accommodate a student in an iron lung. But barring that, it's a 30-year-old civil rights law, and it's about damn time people started following it.
Deb, do you have thoughts on this within our university?
Yeah, so the way it works, as far as I understand it, is that we are responsible and want to provide accommodations as best we can, regardless of the cost. But there is a clause that says unless of undue hardship. So in the case of undue hardship, and it's not explained exactly what that means, but if it's something that could, break the institution, then I think that would come under the undue hardship, of course. But like Angie said, I think there's lots of different ways you can think around a problem. Because you can't do it this way, there may be another way to get around it that doesn't cost as much. It's not perfect. It's never going to be perfect. And you do have to provide reasonable accommodations. And so that also comes into play. Reasonable accommodations and undue hardship are kind of two of the little buzzwords. Having said that, we want people to get what they need. So one way or another, you have to work around what you've got as best you can. Even if you reach out to other institutions through your networks, you might be able to borrow something occasionally. But there are things that you can, hopefully, for the most part, do just by thinking creatively.
Yeah, which reminds me, if I could add something. I remember hearing about a facility that didn't have the money to put in accessible water fountains, just too much money. So they got their heads together, and for this particular person, the person has good hand strength, and so it was using a wheelchair. So they decided to put cup dispensers next to the water fountain, so the person was able to access. So there's technologies out there that surprised me in terms of how inexpensive. I knew one person who wasn't able to use her arms or legs and needed to turn pages on a book. So she just took a pencil, put a rubber band at the end or a eraser, and used that. She just pushed it over with her turning page stick. So
great. Yeah, I think being creative is definitely one of those things that we need to employ in order to increase our accessibility. There's just one last comment, not really a question, in our chat here. Oh, we got a couple now. Oh my goodness. Okay, the comment first is, sort of speaking of game-based learning, there's the British Library created an 8-bit video game version of their library on their website in place of a typical virtual tour. So it's really neat. It's called the British Library Simulator for anyone interested. So if you guys want to Google that. We do have one last question. I understand that some people need to go. We are at 3:30. If any of our panelists need to go, please feel free, but we'll try and buzz through these as quick as we can. And then I'll put everybody's email addresses and resources up at the end here. Chelsea's asking, how can staff gain a better understanding and physical ability to use or teach the use of accessible controllers, such as Microsoft's adaptive controller, as some of these resources can be vastly different in their physical design than traditional controllers and may be required to adapt to accommodate users of varied levels of mobility?
Yeah, that's a tough one to answer, because I would defer to my colleagues on the panel, but it's really a case-by-case basis. I think the spirit of this question is very well intended insofar that it's how can we train people for every scenario or to anticipate, but sometimes that's difficult. When it comes to technology, I think you can cover your bases by having a lot of things on hand. And like Dale said, a lot of so they cite the Microsoft adaptive controller. And if anyone's seen it, it's a very large board. It almost looks kind of like a guitar pedal board with larger buttons. But the cool thing is the back, where you have every input imaginable. So I think that requires, if you're going to go down that route and gaming is an option for your library, I think you have to not only have that as a platform, but have a bunch of options as well. But there is a huge online community for homemade and custom solutions. So it's never been easier to find examples of how to find workarounds for gaming and technology, and also great online communities where you can post questions and stuff like that. I have never seen such a vibrant community as today. So I think the answers are probably easier to come across than you'd think.
I would agree with everything Eric said, and add to that, just play around with the technology. While I'm not a big fan of simulations, I love the idea of virtual adaptive tech petting zoos, because I think if more people played around with adaptive technology, they'd realize, oh, wait, this solves this little nagging problem I've had forever. Maybe I should use this. And in fact, a lot of technology that people use originated in adaptive technology, like Dragon Naturally Speaking or predictive text on your cell phone. These all originated in technology that was intended for disabled people. So, play around with the technology yourself. If somebody comes to you with a need, listen to them and what they want and any ideas they have on how to use the technology. And if you listen to people and play with it a bit, we can actually accomplish quite a lot towards making things more accessible.
Deb or Dale, do you guys have anything to add?
Oh, nothing here. Good suggestions, good ideas.
I would just say that if you do find the answers, whether it's Googling it or maybe finding somebody who has some experience with those sorts of things, it'd be great to share that information, with your colleagues maybe, or with the library or a central place, so that any kind of work that you've done working specifically with somebody to make something work to overcome whatever the barrier is, share that information. And then the next person who has that same issue would have at least a starting point.
Yeah, that's a great idea. One last thing in the session, Kathy just said, thank you so much for this session. I appreciate the engaging speakers and the panel input. She's not planning a gaming event, but she appreciates the discussion of accessibility, makes her think about other group-based programs that she's hosted and will be hosting where she's not considered many of these things. And as someone who does outreach and does program planning at our university, there are so many things that you guys have enlightened me to today that I just never really crossed my mind. So thank you so much for doing this. I think this is a really important topic, and I just want to say thank you to our presenters that have joined us from the US, and our panelists that have joined us from their homes today, and everybody who came out. Does anyone have some final words?
Thanks everybody for showing the interest and coming out here today.
Yes, thanks very much for the invite. That's very
Mark,
gracious.
thanks also. We certainly appreciate the opportunity to share gamification gaming and to meet the others here on the panel.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Richard says, thank you for all your time and expertise. Very informative presentation and discussion. You're getting applause, and thank you. Right now, I'm just going to put the resources post up here so that folks can write down email addresses and that if they need them.
Thank you.
I will be sending out to every registered participant, I will be sending out a recorded version of this. So if you want to share it with your colleagues or you want to go back and review something, you're more than welcome to do that. Yeah, thank you so much for coming and joining us here today, you guys. It's been wonderful to have you. We hope to have some more expert panels in the future. I'm working on some stuff, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.